Live from the internet. It's Friday night.
Live.
That's right. It was kind of a sunny week. I was going to say a sunny Friday, but I'm not quite sure. But at least it's been a sunny week. This week, we are very excited to have Cristina Falcone from UPS Europe. She's got extensive communication experience, over 20 years working in communication, in public affairs, in a range of different topics. And she's with us here today to talk about something quite critical, among others. And this is about diversity and inclusion. So why do you think this is so important to you personally and to your organization?
For me, this is very, very important. It's something that I'm passionate about. So it's so great to be here talking with you about this today. Companies are understanding the benefits of ensuring diversity, not only diversity, but inclusion within their companies. Many still have a ways to go, but ultimately most companies are understanding the benefits that you get when you truly include diverse perspectives. And it's so critical right now. Why am I passionate about it? Why do I feel it's so important for companies? Is because we are faced with a lot of challenges, and that's going to take a lot of problem solving and innovation. And doing things the way we've done in the past, where we don't have inclusive voices at the table, is just not going to get us there to those solutions. Not only that, it's fair, and I truly believe in equity in the world and in the workplace. And so for these reasons, I am just passionate about putting effort and awareness and education around what needs to be done and how companies can embrace DE&I.
Right, and I think you're raising a really important topic, something that's been in the news, through a number of different issues. Now, I think the interesting thing is that I guess in the past, companies, didn't talk so much about diversity and inclusion, and I think the reality is probably that not only wasn't it a high priority, but there were a lot of problems in a lot of companies. And I think with media pressure, with social media, that has changed recently. So everybody is making statements. I'm sure you've heard the expression virtue signaling. So people saying that they are doing something. Now, the question is, how do you make these things real? As opposed to talk about why it's important, how does an individual in your position, and how does a company bring about diversity and inclusion so that it's not just a statement, but it's a reality of the company?
Yes, and that's so important, because I think the reason also why it's necessary is our talent, the company's talent expects that. The future talent is going to bring in expects that other stakeholders in the community don't just want a slogan out there. They want to see authenticity. And so how you actually implement DE&I beyond a statement or virtual signaling is critical. And that starts really with clearly taking the time to define what are the values, what is the purpose of your organization. Because without that, you're not going to get to authentic and real implementation clearly defined. And then from there, if the leadership needs to be bought in, you also need to listen to your employees to actually understand from that community what is important to them and where your gaps are, and how you can address, then take things from there and how you can address things to make things better. So a lot of it has to do with back to corporate culture, and then implementation through listening, including leadership and bottom-up conversations.
Phil, you're on mute.
Excellent. I'm very happy that I got to do our COVID moment. But no, I was just telling you, Cristina, that we're having a little bit of a lag with the sound, but by and large it's okay. But sometimes I might come back to you with a point if we have that. Yeah, and you were talking about the challenges of putting it in practice. Now you mentioned a hashtag, break the bias. I mean, how useful are these, hashtags, these Twitter conversations in maybe raising awareness of issues and then, doing things that actually matter to people so that they bring about change? Do you think is it again, more communication without substance, or have you seen this actually lead to real change and real conversations that help people in practice?
I certainly think, listen, we're living in an age where social media channels and the following of society and communities are following these hashtags, and it's a great way to get the conversation going. So do I see value in the hashtags like break the bias? Definitely, because these are mediums that we have to us to hear different perspectives, but it has to go beyond that. And frankly, as I said before, the employees and different members of society will see through it if your company's not actually living up to that break the bias. We've got, International Women's Day in March, and many companies can go out with this hashtag. But a savvy stakeholder or future employer will take a look and say, okay, so now what is this company doing actually to advance women's economic empowerment, right? Either within the organization or outside of the organization. And if they're not doing anything, then that's going to send a pretty clear message that it was just a tagline. And that can actually be even more damaging. So it can be very powerful, but it's got to be backed up by clear actions. Otherwise, it just comes across as shallow.
Yeah, and I think it goes to the question about company values, which is, how much of the company values. I mean, every company has a mission statement, principles that they write. A lot of the time, they do feel a bit generic. It's like we respect, integrity, team, people, diversity, inclusion. So what's been your experience about, how much the values of the company, in particular UPS, resonate with you and with the behavior of people, and how do you use that maybe to make people more accountable for that?
I think it's incredibly important to get the language around your company values right. So when our new CEO for UPS, Carol Tomei, started, within the first few months, she said, we've got to get our purpose statement clearly defined. We always had very strong company values, and I think that most employees could indicate what they were. But she really wanted to add the why. Why is it that we work at UPS? And it was great timing because it was, when she started, but then we headed into the pandemic. And so we ran focus groups and we had different perspectives weighing into this. And we got to a process, but, quite quickly. And we defined our purpose statement, moving the world forward by delivering what matters. And we provided examples of why have we chosen this purpose statement, which tied to all of those core values that we had. We value our people, our development, our people development. We value safety. Delivering what matters is making sure that our driver gets home to his family at the end of the day. That's why we value safety. Now we're getting into wider services like healthcare, like vaccine. And we also care, as we always have, in supporting underprivileged communities. So this means we're delivering what matters, delivering COVID vaccines to underdeveloped countries of the world. So I think it's, the language is quite important. It's good to come up with something that everyone can remember, but is meaningful to them. And of course, if it ties into those strongly rooted values that your company has, then people will quickly embrace it and be even more confident in living that purpose statement. And so for me, that was quite powerful. I was really happy to see that purpose statement being defined because, again, as a communicator, of course, I think we can all agree words and language can be very, very powerful, and that's what purpose statements offer.
That's so excellent. I think it's especially excellent that it was done together with employees because you see these days that employees really want to be a part of the company. They don't just buy into, comfortable working hours or maybe working from home, but also what does it stand for? Because religion, companies come in almost in I was reading that they see it as a new religion, so you have to really be able to be a part of it. So it's excellent. I think that UPS has decided to make employees a core part of that purpose strategy. I'd like to go back to the bias, the unconscious bias you mentioned before with the Break the Bias hashtag. What are the biases that you personally were most interested in? Which ones did you find out and you were like, oh, I didn't even realize that I was doing this, or that I had that? Because I think most people don't. They feel quite open-minded, right? We feel like we're not having biases. So could you give me an example maybe of such a bias?
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think that for me, as a rising professional, started with UPS, quite young in my career. I've always been passionate about women's development, advancing in the career, equal treatment, inclusiveness for women as professionals, and getting a seat at the table. And so that's something that I've gotten involved with quite early on in my career in terms of the Women's Leadership Development Resource Group, some engagement externally. And as I continued to engage externally, I realized that I was doing a lot to help to support bringing women's voices to the table, getting women on panels, for example, that are experts. But then I thought, well, am I also really embracing and understanding the unconscious biases out there amongst people of color, amongst women of color? Are they getting the seat at the table? So, as we're pulling these speakers, are we making sure that we have that voice at the table too? Am I being conscious and looking for that? Because there is still quite a big gap there. Even, while women are advancing, we still are lagging in terms of women of color advancing, or women, in the LGBT community, for example. So these different biases. So not just taking a look at, through one lens, but also trying to catch myself in advancing these other items as well. So I'm involved in an external community called Rise and Lead Women. And what this organization does is it provides different types of training for women in their careers, and it also helps workplaces to advance balanced leadership. And we're really making a focus this year as we organize our summit to make sure that wherever possible on our panels and our speakers, we are making it diverse, also including women of color, right? And I think for me, that's just been something that I've caught in myself that I never thought that I would be lacking in that area, but I realized I need to be doing more to activate around that in terms of my advocacy externally.
Are there also biases in language?
I think there's definitely biases in language. I mean, you see now, I can see being in Europe with so many nationalities and it being quite international, I still sense sometimes when you're working in an Anglophone environment, whether it be a conference or so on, that you have maybe somewhat this bias if someone has an accent or anything on that end, that I think that we do need to address that and just understand that diversity truly is diversity in many ways. And we're all influenced by how we were raised. So if English is your first language, then you may take a look and say, you might be judging that person even unconsciously as less effective than someone else, say, for example, that has English as a first language. And so those are the areas to check. And we call each other out on issues like this, even in UPS when we're discussing talent and we're discussing opportunities, that we just make sure that we keep each other in check on embracing different types of talents and skill sets that people bring without having that unconscious bias affected, by holding each other in trust to be able to flag that to a colleague.
Yeah, and I think we have a few comments. Daniel saying happy Friday, and we got Ajali saying, I strongly believe inclusion and diversity are very important factors for employer branding, solid corporate culture, and for innovation and sustainability. And I would say, I think I absolutely agree that it's key, but I think the real test is how far it goes in practice. Because I think that's the real challenge that we all have, which is, we have an idea, but we need to find a way to put it in practice. We have another comment from Justin saying, with more and more millennial and Gen Zs entering the workforce, there might be a significant paradigm shift with not just automatically abiding by the company values, but also helping reform them and shape them to make the company more attuned to the times, which I think is happening, because there's clearly a conversation. Interestingly, at home, I have a lot of these conversations. My wife is from India, and my kids are obviously have this mixed heritage, and they love to point out that I'm an old white male, and that that there, and I mean, it's very interesting because you can have these very practical, direct perspective on, okay, and obviously it's obviously very, very immediate, but I think the key thing is that we are incredibly strongly shaped by our culture, our upbringing, the perspective that we just take for granted, and I think that then they become invisible to us, and I think it's only when you start having those conversations and you realize, because I think the key thing about these unconscious biases is that we just don't see them, and even when we read about them and we're told you have this unconscious bias, that's not going to change it. So I think you need a lot more. I think as a business, as you said, you also need to take specific actions, bring people in panels and things like that. But I think for it to sip through the culture, it takes those discussions, those panels, and then it then has to start being baked into the culture. I think maybe the question is, it has to be about listening to people in the organization and outside the organization. And so how do you organize and structure listening to actually, use that listening to actually bring about change in your organization?
That's an excellent point. I think listening is a critical ingredient into making headway anywhere, in terms of addressing where you might have unconscious bias, in terms of understanding what is important to your employees. Because as you said, increasingly now, the employees want to help to drive the purpose and the direction and the culture of the company. And how great is that, right? I mean, we've got such talented people in the company that want to drive the culture forward in a very positive way. But that will only happen if we involve them in the dialogue. So really, it starts with breaking down these barriers of conversational access and hierarchy, right? So getting integrated in terms of the leadership with employees. Focus groups are always great. We do culture pulse to understand how are people feeling. Would they recommend this company to other friends or family to work for? And then just having these dialogues with them on why or why not, right? And I think that listening is also important in terms of when you're taking a look at your communications, also to understand where your biases may be based on other communications that are out there where in the past maybe you haven't been paying attention to. So I always suggest to other senior leaders that may fall in a certain age demographic, let's say like me, say, are you following social media accounts that look different and think maybe a little bit different to you? Because that's who our employees are following, right? So, or that may be consisting of our employees. So are we listening to what is culturally important to the working groups? And then it comes down to, really putting forward programs, because you have to have a plan to address these things. If you see a gap, if you truly say you want to become more inclusive, starts with listening and focus groups, but how are you going to build that into your culture? Is it safe for someone to call out a comment that is not inclusive? Do you have a culture that is safe? That you might need to clearly say that from now on, if you see something that's language being used that's not inclusive, that you act on it. Are you training, let's say, your management staff to call out maybe a quieter member in the group that hasn't contributed to the meeting? It all has to be implemented through, some tangible actions.
Yeah, and I think something interesting about culture and humor is that, for example, you might have, especially when you're working in a, multicultural organization, where somebody makes a joke which they think is pretty innocent, but actually is pretty offensive to some groups or whatever. But from their perspective, that might not be the case. And I think this is an important conversation to have, because it also makes people feel that you're not just allowing this to happen, but you're also taking action on that. And I think one other thing I would say is that, I think we when we have this conversation, we probably think, yeah, this all makes sense and it's kind of reasonable, and we're talking about things, and I think for some people they might say, oh yeah, this all sounds a bit corporate and generic. But I think what's important to realize is that if you look around today, we've had Brexit, Trump, we've got the war in Ukraine, we've got these events that remind us that history can also move backwards, and that these issues of trying to move to more tolerance and things like that are not things that are automatic. And you can really have the opposite. And I think people need to realize that you can have organizations where the culture is totally uninclusive, and where they don't are. So it's not just the first step is to say we want to do that, we want to implement it. But I think we shouldn't be complacent and think that this somehow happens automatically over time. I think it needs a lot of work. And one of the ways we get to that, I guess, is by reading, by informing ourselves on new trends. So you had a few book recommendations to share with us. So tell us, what are your recommendations to our audience this week?
Yes, I would strongly recommend the book Inclusify by Stephanie K. Johnson. And this is just a really great book that talks about, and it touches on this theme, how maybe even companies or people may have great intentions, but how those good intentions can also lead you to fall into traps that are not necessarily productive and truly advancing inclusivity in your community or in your workplace. So that one was one that I really enjoyed and helped me to think about things in a different way. The other one was How to Sell is Human by Daniel Pink. And he puts out a lot in terms of communications and management. And the reason I like that one too is also it touches a lot on, what he calls attunement, right? And listening, not just having empathy, but understanding your audience or your stakeholders, or it could be your employees, right? And so those are two that I found to be quite helpful if you truly want to think about ways and understand tips on how to advance inclusivity and how to use communications effectively, including the tool of listening.
Yeah, actually, Daniel Pink has a TED talk as well, which I think is quite good. It's got a summary on the sell, why we're all salespeople, because we're selling ideas, we're trying to convince each other. He's also got a book called The Power of Regret, which I'm actually reading right now. It's fascinating. And you also had a podcast recommendation.
Yes, a podcast recommendation is Why Language Matters. And I really like that one. Sounds like similar maybe to the one that you had last week, where you're listening to people with different perspectives. So they do a lot of interviews with just people from different aspects of society. It might be a trans person, it might be a person of color who's a female, and it allows you to get the perspective of what they faced with a specific focus on language. And as I mentioned before, language is very important, and some of this may also play into unconscious bias, but it can be extremely helpful, it can be hurtful, and it can be used effectively if we understand how it impacts others. And so that's one podcast that I felt helps to give that perspective.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, the power of a word to shape your perception. I was watching a series of YouTube videos about why blue didn't exist in Greek, ancient Greek language, because they just didn't have a word for it. And so that means they use different things. And again, you then don't see certain things because you don't have a word for them. So I think that's fascinating. Lior, I think you have a TED talk for us to recommend.
I have a TED Talk to recommend indeed if you are either feeling lonely or if you are very anti-social media. For both those purposes, I recommend You Are Not Alone in Your Loneliness by Johnny Sun. It's already from 2019, and it's basically about a fact where the time in his life where he was feeling very lonely, and he went on Twitter and started discussing some of these topics, and found out there were many people suffering from the same fears, from the same feelings. And then he felt comfortable enough to find a therapist, and he said it was such a support system, which is so opposite to the perception of Twitter. It's a very nicely structured TED Talk, and actually there are a lot of and also I was also watching another TED Talk about this topic. It has such a stigma, being lonely. Being lonely means you don't have friends, you're not likable, there must be something wrong with you. And so we put all these labels on people, and the internet can be a great way for people to step out of it and to find others that they connect with without having to share that feeling with with an intimate real life people. So so I'm happy that Twitter can play a positive role for.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting to think that because there's so much press. I mean, I think every Netflix documentary and every story seems to be about how social media is destroying everything from the well-being of teenagers to the entire fabric of society. And what I think it kind of misses is that first of all, a lot of this is a reflection of bigger issues that are going on in society, and it's not correlation is not causation. So I think we need to look at things from a broader perspective, and I think you can have a very constructive experience of social media. In fact, a lot of the discussions we have in Brussels and beyond on social media are pretty constructive. I mean, I think the whole kind of people insulting and things like that, I think that happens around specific topics, around specific communities, but it doesn't have to be that way. And you have quite a lot of very constructive conversations. I have one recommendation, which is from a book from Ray Dalio, who wrote a book called Principles, which was all about the principles that he uses as a guide, which there are lots of nice videos and things like that. This is a kind of study on how the world is changing. It's pretty big. And I have to be honest, I haven't quite finished it, but it gives a framework to understand how the world is changing, how countries, empires disintegrate and get replaced. So to understand the bigger picture in what's happening today geopolitically, it's quite fascinating. It's quite dense. You have to like economics and politics and kind of bigger trends and factors. So that would be my recommendation. I just before I close, I wanted to ask you one thing, Cristina, on your topics of inclusive diversity. What would be your one kind of advice to communicators? What do you think people can do better to improve that in their own life and in their organizations?
I think for me, again, I would point it back to engage with communities and people that are different to yourself. Open up your perspective and listen. I think those are the two key recommendations that I would have.
Absolutely. So I think listening is critical, and we're going to listen to Liora before we.
I wanted to say one more thing. If you're in Brussels and you're feeling lonely, and you're a mother, for example, you could join a Facebook group which is called English-Speaking Mothers in Brussels, if you're English-speaking, obviously. Also, if you're trying to buy a house in Brussels and you're not Belgian and you're feeling overwhelmed, there's a Facebook group. It's called Owning in Brussels, which is excellent, which helps with everything from finding the right resources to do renovations. So Facebook can be I know everyone's very down on Facebook and it might be horrible in many ways, but it's really fantastic for those types of communities. So Owning in Brussels and English-Speaking Mothers in Brussels, I recommend both those groups very much.
Absolutely. And they're not sponsoring this video, so
no, not at all.
It's almost like you want to buy this. But thank you so much, Cristina and Liora. Have a fantastic weekend. It's great to hear what you had to say, and we will continue the conversation online. Have a fantastic
Thank you so much, Cristina.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.